the implications for human health and the environment are radically different depending on how the livestock are raised. And what's interesting is that you get tremendous benefits when you have the good grazing that you don't get even when you totally remove the animals. You want to have really good management of the animals. And when you do that, it has dramatically positive impacts for the soil health and the water, the protection of the water, and even for climate change.
Beef. Whether you eat it or not, this is really important information you need to know. Hi, this is Dr. Mercola helping you take control of your health. And today I am joined by Nicolette Hahn Niman, who has a very interesting combination and skill set that allowed her to develop an expertise in this area. And she's going to share what she's learned over the last 15 years and help us really fully appreciate the impact of beef in our own life and the environment. So Nicolette, you're a woman of many talents. You're a rancher, a lawyer, an author, and a mother. And you have a very interesting story that goes back about 15 years when you were living as a vegetarian attorney in Manhattan and working for Robert Kennedy Jr. So why don't you pick up the story there and tell us, or even earlier if it's appropriate, to how you began on your journey in this area.
Yes. Well, I agree. I have an unusual sort of combination of different, aspects of my life story. And I believe it helps me to see this, the issue of how we raise livestock from lots of different perspectives. So I'm originally from Michigan, and I was one of those kids who kind of spent a lot of time outside growing up. And when I went to college, I majored in biology because I love nature and was already involved in environmental causes. And it was actually in college as a freshman that I became a vegetarian, largely because I believed that it was the right thing to do as a citizen of the world. I heard a lot about how meat was resource intensive and was, sort of too resource intensive, and was, I remember specifically hearing that beef was the main cause of deforestation in the Amazon. So I made the choice at that time to become a vegetarian.
Did you go to Ann Arbor?
I went to Ann Arbor for law school, to University of Michigan,
okay.
But my undergrad work was done at Kalamazoo College.
Oh,
and
okay.
I had this, passion for the environment and went to law school. And many years later, I was practicing as a lawyer back in my hometown of Kalamazoo. I had already lived elsewhere, but I had moved back there. I was on the city council of the city of Kalamazoo, and I heard Bobby Kennedy Jr. give a speech about how citizens can use the environmental laws to protect the environment, that sort of a unique ability that citizens have in the United States. Mm-hmm. And that really motivated me to get involved as a lawyer for protecting the environment. And then I first worked for National Wildlife Federation, and then was given the opportunity to work directly for Bobby Kennedy in New York. And he asked me to work full-time on the issue of livestock pollution, livestock-related pollution, because he was traveling all over the United States and hearing from a lot of people that it was the primary environmental problem in their community. And yet the government on federal and state level and nonprofit organizations were not doing very much in response. And so he felt that we needed, as an environmental organization, Waterkeeper Alliance was the name of the group, to really take on the issue. And he asked me to lead that effort. And so I was actually a little bit reluctant at first because, I just had this very negative view of meat production in the meat industry. And I sort of felt like, well, as a vegetarian, I don't have anything to do with this anyways. So why would I want to work on this?
Not my problem.
Right, exactly. I'm doing my part, But then, Bobby is a very wise person, and he just urged me. He said, go to the communities where these industrial operations are and see what this is for yourself. And that began this whole journey for me, which is, that was the year 2000. So for the last 15 years, I've been really focused on the issue of livestock and how it's produced and what the implications are. And, it was really on that job that I first learned that the implications for human health and the environment are radically different depending on how the livestock are raised.
Interesting. So that's quite a journey.
Well,
And you actually have written a book too, called Defending Beef, that goes, and you, well, why don't you continue the journey? Because
yeah,
you were in Manhattan, and I think that's where we stopped it. And
right.
then you got married, and then you moved actually out to a ranch.
Right. Well, it was through the work for Bobby Kennedy that I met many farmers and ranchers all over the country. And I was also seeing a lot of, and touring inside and out, a lot of industrial animal operations. So I was really seeing all types of livestock and dairy and poultry production and egg production, and witnessing firsthand, sort of the radically different systems in terms of their implications and the quality of life for the animals, et cetera. And through that, I met Bill Niman, who's the founder of a network of 800 farmers and ranchers around the country. And the reason the Niman farmers and ranchers were so interesting to us when I was working for Waterkeeper was because they were using methods that were very environmentally sustainable. So we wanted to have real world examples to point to as a model for the direction that the industry needed to move in as a whole. And then about a year after leaving the Waterkeeper Alliance job, I did that full time for 2 years, and I decided to leave that job for various reasons, but I knew I wanted to continue working on this issue because I felt by that time I was totally dedicated to making an impact on it, and I wanted to keep working on it. And I began researching a book, and during that time, I ended up getting to know Bill Niman, the founder of the Niman Ranch Network, better, and eventually married him about a year later, and moved from my small Manhattan apartment to a ranch north of San Francisco in Northern California. And initially, I just thought I would continue my work as an environmental lawyer. But living here every day and spending time here, I just got so sort of fascinated and enamored with the amazing things that were happening around me, and I wanted to be directly involved. And so I started working on the ranch every day, and I've been doing that ever since. So that's been 12 years. So
Wow.
I've continued a vegetarian diet, and so I feel I'm probably one of the very few vegetarian ranchers in the world. But I know there are a few of us. I'm not the only one. But
Is your husband a vegetarian?
not at all.
I would think not, being a founding rancher. So.
But we've had an interesting influence on each other, I think, in terms of our diets and our whole perspectives on these issues. And it's kind of, we have a great deal of mutual respect for one another, obviously, or we would never have gotten married. But we actually have remarkably sort of common views on these issues. And, we both feel that you can make a very healthful diet without meat, but that also you can eat very healthfully. In fact, I think probably optimally the diet would include meat. But it's all about how the meat is produced. And we feel we want to be part of sort of forging this new generation of farming and ranching, which is really happening in many parts of the world and in the country. People realizing that things have gone in a very bad direction and trying to rebuild the food system. And we're very committed to doing that.
Okay, so you're really a strong advocate and one of the leaders in helping people understand the importance of properly raised meat and way outside of the CAFO operation. So I'm wondering if your choice to continue as a vegetarian is based on health principles or philosophical principles.
No, it's definitely not health. We now have 2 young sons, and I spend a great deal of time every day preparing their food and, gathering their food. I mean, we actually do quite a bit of foraging here. We grow a lot of our own food, and of course we raise our own meat. And then I cook, every day. Much of my time is spent cooking and cleaning up the dishes. So a whole bunch of my time and effort is gone, spent every day in feeding them well, and feeding my husband well, of course, too, and myself well. And I am very committed to feeding them meat and eggs and dairy products, because I really do believe, especially for younger people and older people, that meat is a very important part of the diet. That being said, my own decision was based on my belief at the time that it was not good for the environment to raise animals for food, that it was bad for one's health. And those two views I have sort of radically shifted in terms of feeling that probably optimal environmental food, from an environmental perspective, food production does include animals. And an optimal human diet includes animal-based foods, including meat. But for me, one of the primary motivations was just this very intense attachment I've always felt for animals. And it makes me more comfortable not to eat meat, but I do eat animal-based food. So I eat plenty of dairy and eggs
and butter.
Oh, lots of butter. I'm a big advocate of all of those foods, and I'm a strong proponent of sort of rebuffing a lot of the misinformation that's out there about meat and animal fat and dairy and eggs and all the.
I'm just curious, and of course it's only an anecdotal observation, but if you noticed any changes in your health once you started incorporating some of the animal products into your diet.
Well, I never stopped eating eggs and dairy products.
Okay.
And I think that's critical. I mean, in my view, there's a dramatic, from you're the expert on this, not me, but from my readings and my research, I feel there's a dramatic difference nutritionally between vegetarianism and veganism. And I've never followed a vegan diet, and personally, I would not recommend it to anyone.
Okay. All right. So we've got over that hump.
Yes.
So maybe you can tell us about your journey in putting together your book, Defending Beef, and how long it took to compile that, and what was the motivation behind it, and then we can go into some of the details of the book.
Well, when I worked for Bobby Kennedy, I realized that one of the, I knew very little about the issue when I was first asked by him to work on it. And as I was discussing it with people around me, friends and family, I realized that they knew very little about the way livestock was raised in this country and how radically that had changed over the last half century. And so I felt that there needed to be, more and more vehicles to sort of raise public awareness on this. And so I began working on a book, and I did write an earlier book that I completed was published in 2009. And that book is called Righteous Pork Chop: Finding a Life and Good Food Beyond Factory Farms. So that book was really a sort of a description of how all of the major animal foods are produced, and then arguing that, the sort of industrial methods were bad for the environment, bad for humans, and bad for animals. And then I made the argument as well that more traditional methods, more grass-based methods especially, were the opposite, were healthful and were good for the environment. Then subsequent to that book coming out, I was, I do a lot of public speaking, and I did a lot of interviews surrounding, this issue in that first book. And I was sort of getting increasingly frustrated by the oversimplification that I kept feeling was happening with this issue. And especially when it came to beef, I kept hearing this notion that it was just too resource intensive. It was too damaging to the environment, and that it was really something that, the less of it, the better, both on the plate and on the land. And so, especially someone who's now been directly involved in raising cattle for the last 12 years, I see what we do on our own ranch every day. And I've been to, dozens and dozens of farms and ranches around the country that raise livestock. And I've seen the tremendous benefits, to the whole natural cycle in having the animals there. So I felt that someone that had genuine environmental credentials, but also really understood the agricultural side, needed to make the case that well-raised cattle belong in an ecologically optimal food system.
So in your research and compiling the book, I'm wondering what you uncovered as perhaps some of the most startling or outrageous practices that were going on in CAFO farms that the typical person isn't aware of.
Well, I think one of the most troubling aspects regarding beef. Now, I have to preface this by saying that I've felt for a long time, and I argue in both of my books, that beef is actually, in many ways, the least troubling sector. It's kind of ironic because it gets so much of the public attention. But when you look at the life cycle of beef cattle, it's much more connected to, the way nature functions. The people and the animals are outside, and all of the beef cattle are on grass, pasture or rangeland for a good portion of their lives, even those that end up in feedlots. Now, that's in stark contrast to the way most eggs and dairy and pork and poultry is produced, which is really continual confinement, totally enclosed systems where the animals are on concrete floors, a very inhospitable environment, both for the animals and the workers and for, producing healthful food. So I have to preface my response by saying that.
Sure.
Okay. But
thank you.
That being said, there are some very troubling practices that are, sort of mainstream beef production is doing. And I would say probably at the top of the list is some of the things that are added to the feed and are administered to the animals, which has the potential, many problematic aspects of that. It has a potential to contaminate the food. It definitely ends up in the environment. And it's also something that there's good evidence affects the welfare of the animals while they're alive. So, for example, antibiotics are being used routinely throughout the meat industry as a feed additive, and especially this is true in beef cattle feedlots. Now, when animals are living on pasture, this is pretty much not done at all. But once they're in feedlots, they're very often fed antibiotics. And that's done to promote rapid growth of the animals, and it works quite effectively. The problem is that there's a lot of research showing that this contributes to the rise of antibiotic resistance throughout the environment and on the meat. And so there are many, many good reasons that that should not be permitted, but that's quite widespread. I was very surprised as well how widespread the use of growth hormones is. So, I knew this is, I've known this for a long time that growth hormones are used in beef production. I didn't realize how ubiquitous it is. So it's done on the majority of cattle ranches that end up, for the cattle that end up in the mainstream system. And it is also done almost universally at feedlots. So again, those cattle that are going through the feedlots is where you really have the real problems. And similar.
But that's not so much in dairy production, because I think that issue was resolved a while
right.
ago. Maybe I'm mistaken.
Dairy production, there was use of growth hormones that it never reached more than about 30% of the dairy herd, though. It's much more ubiquitous in beef production.
Interesting.
So.
And what's the current use in dairy?
I haven't heard recent statistics. The data I looked at a couple of years ago on that indicated that it reached about 30% of the dairy herd. It plateaued and it was beginning to come down. The reason for that is because, it's kind of ironic. We have this huge problem within agriculture of overproduction. And actually, one of the main reasons that those hormones were banned in Europe is because they knew they had an overproduction problem and they didn't want to make it worse. And so part of the reason that the dairy industry as a whole did not embrace the dairy hormones is because people sort of understood that there was already too much milk, and producing more of it was not going to be helpful. But there was a really strong consumer resistance to that. So there began to be a labeling movement that it's raised without the use of growth hormones in the milk, and there was pretty strong consumer pushback on that. For some reason, that hasn't happened as clearly in the beef sector, and so the beef industry has still not gotten that message.
That's interesting. Do you think it might be due to the concentration, that the concentration might have been higher in milk than it is in the beef
honestly, I think it goes back to mothers. So, every mother in America, with very few exceptions, right, wants their children to be eating, sort of an optimal diet that includes generally milk. And so children of a very young age, it's recommended recommended not before 1 year of age, but around a year of age, children begin consuming dairy milk, cow's milk usually, and people are really have a heightened sensitivity about what they're giving young children, which they should. I mean, that's good. And so I think this idea that there was some contaminant or a possibility of contaminant in the milk was very problematic for one of the major consumers of milk, the mothers, and not just for young children, but for all children especially. So I think that's why that issue was a little bit distinct from some other food issues.
Okay. Now, your ranch is in California, and raw milk is legal in California, and I'm wondering if you have a dairy herd out there where you're able to produce and provide that that product.
It is widely available. We know many people that are either offering raw milk to the public, excuse me, or raise it for themselves. We actually got a cow of our own, a dairy cow. Mm-hmm. There's a very big difference between beef cows and dairy cows. And so we got ourselves a Jersey cow, and it was our intention to use her as our own family milk source. But an interesting thing happened. Our older son, who's now 6, started to lose his taste for fluid milk. He still, eats lots of yogurt and cheese and meat and other things, so we're not too worried about it. But the motivation that we had was kind of diminished because it's a lot of work to milk your cow every day.
Yeah, unless you have an automated process, that's for sure.
Yeah, and if it's interesting because we just had her with our beef cattle herd. And so, when she's with them, it's not any work at all to have her. And she's still with us, and she's actually been really helpful because we've had some years where we had extra calves when, like, a mother cow will have twins and doesn't want to take both of them. And so she's become what we call a nursemaid for our dairy cows. But our feeling is if we're going to consume raw milk, we want to raise it ourselves.
Okay, great. That's a good idea. So getting back to your book on the beef and the observation that most of the beef that's produced in industrial operations are injected with growth hormones. I'm wondering what percentage of the beef is CAFO in the United States versus authentic grass-fed, not factory farmed, and given to feeding lots in their last 3 months of life.
Right. So again, I have to qualify my answer a little bit.
Sure.
Pretty much all the mother cows in the United States are on grass, and all the calves are on grass. And it's only when they reach, sometimes it's younger, but typically it's around a year of age that they go into a feedlot. The reason I make that distinction is when you're talking about the ecological impacts, that's a really important point to understand, because many very well managed ranches that are doing a beautiful job with their animals and with land husbandry, with land stewardship, are actually unfortunately sending their calves, or their yearlings basically, into the mainstream beef system. So that's unfortunate. But when we talk about ecological impacts, it's just important to keep that distinction in mind. So the totally grass-fed sector is only about 5% of the total beef, the beef industry. It is growing, and our sort of the overall consumption of beef has been sort of steadily declining for the last 3 decades. But the grass-fed sector is rising. So it makes a strong case for people within, the beef industry, people, raising cattle, to get into the totally grass-fed sector. That's one of the good news. That's part of the good news.
Well, that's an important distinction that I previously wasn't aware of, that a significant percentage of the beef or the cattle that are raised that are eventually wind up in the feeding lots are actually raised properly. And so there's a subset of these groups, ones that are not and ones that are. So maybe you can talk about those two different groups and what characterizes their differences.
Well, when you're looking at what's happening on the ranches and the farms, which again is a source for both, the sort of totally conventionally raised and the naturally raised, totally grass-fed beef, the key question is, how are the animals managed on the land? And there's a lot of research that's happening on this all over the world right now because, there's this sort of urgent question of, how do we feed the people of the world? There's an urgent question of how do we protect water resources? And now, of course, there are concerns about climate change. So people want to know, how do we do this in the best possible way? So there's a great deal of research taking place all over the world on this. And what the research is, actually, I was just speaking at a conference in Burlingame, California, a few days ago, hosted by the Savory Institute, which was literally a worldwide gathering, an international gathering of people from all over the world talking about this very issue. How do you regenerate the environment using cattle? And I saw a really good presentation by Dr. Richard Teague, who's at Texas A&M, and he's been researching sort of the impacts of cattle grazing for decades. And the point that he just sort of succinctly stated it, sort of the more densely congregated the animals are, and the more frequently they're moving, the better. That's kind of the bottom line. So that's going to vary dramatically depending on what geography you're in, the climate and the time of year. All kinds of factors are going to enter it. There's no one formula. But basically, the goal is to mimic the environmental impact, the way, from an ecosystem's perspective, the way the animals are functioning in the ecosystem of the wild animals that were once there. And so that's the basic idea. You want to have really good management of the animals. And when you do that, it has dramatically positive impacts for the soil health and the water, the protection of the water, and even for climate change. So that's the key.
Sure. Yeah, I actually attended the first Alan Savory event in the United States, which I think was 2 years ago in Boulder.
Oh, great.
Yeah, so I'm familiar somewhat with it. I would imagine that the differences between those two groups relate to most of the principles that Alan is teaching with holistic herd management, with the mob grazing and the density of and frequently moving them, and there's a variety of ways to do that. But so that's the distinction between the two groups. One is they're just the one group. Maybe what is the non-healthy way to do it? If you could summarize that.
I would have to say there's a huge, a spectrum, right?
Sure. There's a
so
range,
you have people that are doing an extremely good job, and then you have people that are doing a poor job, and there's everything in between. And most of the people that I'm talking to nowadays, especially because I'm talking to people that are, sort of on the progressive end of the spectrum in terms of the ranching community, really sort of trying to do the best possible practices. And that's quite a significant number of people. But I would say they're somewhere on that spectrum, and they're trying to get as far over, to the very good side of the spectrum as possible. And so there's this constant dialogue happening within the ranching and farming community about how to do things better. But I think that the sort of worst practice is basically where you're what they call continuous grazing, where you're basically allowing animals to have access to a very large tract of land. And, when you look back at the ranching that was done in the 1850s in this country, for example, a lot of it was done this way, where you'd have them covering an enormous area of land, let's say thousands of acres. And basically they were just allowed to be there for, year round. And then you would gather them at a certain point in time. And, you might do some branding or whatever, and you might take someone's out that you're going to send to slaughter or whatever, and then you just turn them back out. That's kind of like the worst kind of ranching from an environmental perspective. And that was how things were pretty much done, 100 years ago. There's been a dramatic shift toward, this side of the spectrum, the much more carefully managed side of the spectrum over the last century, but especially over the last 30 or 40 years. There's a lot more understanding now that when you move the animals, what that does is the grazing itself has multiple impacts. The typical person I talk to on the street will assume that grazing is a negative. That's no longer really believed by a lot of people, especially the people in the sort of progressive grazing movement. It's believed now that impact is actually essential to ecosystem functioning. But you can't have it continuously. So you need to have sort of high impact. You need to have the hooves pressing down the vegetation into the soil. You need to have the dung coming onto the land, the urine and the dung, which actually are very beneficial to the soil health. And then you need to have the animals leave, and you need to have the resting. The grazing also stimulates the growth of the plant. So it's like you're pruning the plant, you're pressing the seeds into the soil, you're pressing vegetation into the soil, which actually stimulates the biological action, the decay of that vegetation, which is what
the composting.
Exactly. That's a succinct way of stating it. It's basically fostering the composting that takes place naturally in a pasture or rangeland environment. And then you have to get the animals off of it, because you have to allow the resting, the regeneration. And what's amazing is in my book, Defending Beef, I do a lot of comparisons of, sort of areas where there was either not, the sort of continuous grazing, which is not good, or even no grazing, which interestingly are ecologically similar. And then on the other hand, sort of well-managed, carefully managed grazing. And what's interesting is that you get tremendous benefits when you have the good grazing that you don't get even when you totally remove the animals. So that's a very common misconception, that it would be ecologically best to have no animals. And I'm arguing, and I think there's very good evidence for this, that the ecologically optimal system has animals in it, but they have to be managed well.
Well, we just moved locations within your home because the sun shifted up and was starting to wash you out, and I thought it would be better view if we could see you unobstructed by the sunlight. So the next question I have relates sort of a curiosity, as you mentioned, the way that grazing was done initially with animals unrestricted in thousands of acres. Superficially, it would appear that would tend to replicate ancient practices before they were actually confined, but maybe not. Maybe they had access to tens or hundreds of thousands of acres, and that more likely was the ideal. So, I mean, how many acres do you need to? And I guess it's a reflection of how many animals are in the herd. Is to what's the optimal? Because I mean, obviously when the buffalo were in the U.S. and the Indians were, they weren't corralled, they weren't fenced in, and that was one of the large reasons it's believed that the Midwest has some of the finest topsoil in the world, or at least it did at one point.
Yeah,
we've obviously decimated most of that with industrial farming.
Right.
Practices.
Right. And in fact, it was simply plowing even. I talk about it in Defending Beef. There's this whole trajectory that happened with those native prairies in the Great Plains, where you had many feet deep of topsoil and the richest soil in the world.
Right.
And the most important thing that humans are doing was simply stripping that away.
Oh,
and
yes.
so there's this. But to go back to your original question, there's no one answer. It's really important to remember that there are many good farming systems and many good ways of raising animals, and it's very site specific and it's very climate specific. So I would say one thing that's important to remember is you can have small numbers of animals integrated into a diversified farming operation, and that can be a very beneficial way to have animals. But when you're talking about these larger herds, whether you're talking, especially these grazing animals, whether you're talking about cattle or goats or sheep, what's increasingly, the vast majority of those are on these sort of areas where you don't farm, basically, the areas where you can't farm. About 85% of the cattle grazing in the United States is believed to be done on land that cannot be used to grow crops. That's an essential point for people to understand. And when you have those kinds of areas, that kind of topography, it's beneficial to use large herds of animals. And actually, you mentioned the way the buffalo moved and they were unconfined. Yes, they were unconfined, but here's the key point. I actually show pictures of bison in my talks that I do, and I also show pictures of the Cape buffalo on the Serengeti and of caribou on the Arctic. Because when you look at those herds, you actually get a pretty good idea of what the typical wild herd would have looked like for tens of millions of years on the globe, because there were many, many more animals. They were accompanied by enormous numbers of large predators. And so what Alan Savory argues, and I think it's a very credible argument, I really believe this is true, is that they function very differently than a domesticated herd would today if you don't manage them in a certain way. Because basically, if you don't have the predation, if you don't have the pressure of those predators constantly pressuring the animals, they're going to be more dispersed. They don't need to congregate tightly and stay together and continuously move. That's what they would naturally do in a totally intact ecosystem. And when you look at, I mean, for example, in California, just right here where I'm sitting, we had 18 of these large animals, megafauna, the scientists call them, in prehistoric times. And they included 2 different types of lion. They included a tiger. They included enormous numbers of bears. But at the same time, you had these huge grazing herds, of elk and of camels even. People don't believe that, but that's absolutely correct. And even 2 types of elephants. So you had these huge animals that ate vegetation, and then you had these huge predators that, sort of surrounded them and hunted in most of them in groups and packs, and kept those grazing animals moving and tightly bunched. So that's that's the argument. You have to have human intervention to make the domesticated,
to replicate that.
Exactly. Sure. The domesticated grazing will not occur that way unless you sort of manage them properly. Yeah. And I think the evidence for it is really, really good. And both, there's academic research that's being done on sort of, the impact of that kind of grazing, but also there's incredible anecdotal evidence from around the world where you start grazing more in that way, in that sort of mob grazing, it's often called, sort of trying to replicate this wild herd. And the impact on the land is enormous. Literally a completely regenerative effect. It's astonishing when you see the pictures.
Yeah, it's I've seen some of them at Alan's first conference, and it is quite impressive, I must admit. And it rapidly accelerates the building of topsoil. So I mean, it's just I don't know the percentage increase, but it's probably 10 times an increase in the amount of topsoil you're able to create over time.
Yeah, it has, and that has enormous implications for the whole health of the soil, which affects all of the, the life in the whole ecosystem, because the plants are then affected by that and the animals are affected by that. But it also affects the water cycle, because for every 1% of organic matter that's in topsoil, you have 27,000 additional gallons of water that's maintained in that water per acre. So it has a dramatic impact on what happens, in many different ways. The soil, the water, the wildlife, everything is affected.
And you certainly could use it out in California.
Right. And one of the arguments I'm making to people again and again in my talks, because this idea has been coming up in the California drought, which is a historic drought right now. It's believed that it's drier right now than it has been for 500 years. And I'm making the argument that this is not a time to be reducing cattle numbers. This is a time for the whole state to get on board with this idea of really managing these animals really well, because it will actually have drought benefits over the long term if we do that.
Sure, but they have to be managed optimally. Now, I'm particularly curious as to the numbers or the percentages in each group, and as you mentioned earlier, there's a range between the worst product quality practices and the best. But if you could just simply categorize them into 2 categories, good and bad, what percentage is in the good and what percentage is in the bad? I mean, obviously there's no definitive answer, but what's your best guess?
Well, extremely hard question to answer, because I view things really as being on the spectrum. Sure. I would say if you had to cut that spectrum in half and characterize half as bad and half as good, it's probably somewhere around a third of the ranches are doing a really good job and maybe 2/3 are not doing a great job. But that means, what that means is tremendous potential. Opportunity. Exactly. Yeah. Tremendous potential for opportunity.
All right. So I think that's what we wanted to get at. So there's a huge potential opportunity here, and I'm wondering what the changes have been over the last few years. Are you seeing a fairly significant increase in shift into those groups? And are these ranchers starting to comprehend these principles and to adopt them, or and what's the rate at which the change is occurring?
Yes. Well, in defending beef, my whole point is that, beef is basically very defensible and is good for the environment. But the good news about all the criticisms that I'm responding to there is that it is putting pressure on the beef industry to self-examine and to improve itself, right? And so I think on both sides, the sort of health side and, in terms of what we were talking about earlier, the sort of adulterants that are being used in raising cattle, whether it's hormones or antibiotics that are being added, whatever, I think there's more pressure right now to reduce that than ever. And on the ecological side, because there's been so much attention paid to cattle's impact on water and on climate, there's more interest than ever within the cattle community at improving what's happening on the ground. And so, Dr. Alan Williams, who's a wonderful professor of animal science that in the Southeast, and he works nationally on grazing and teaching people how to do really good grass-fed beef. He says that 10 years ago he would be speaking to at a conference with farmers and ranchers, and he'd have 10 people in the room, and now he's speaking to rooms jam-packed with hundreds of people listening to him. And I can testify to that because I was just speaking at the Grass-Fed Exchange Conference, which is a national organization, and I just spoke at their annual conference in Michigan, and he was one of the speakers, and there were 400 people glued to him when he was speaking. So it's, to me, there's tremendous interest within the community of people raising cattle at how to do things better. And there's more and more information available about how to do things better. So I think that's all, again, good news.
Excellent. Well, I'm glad to see things are moving in the right direction. They clearly need to be for a whole variety of areas.
I agree.
Clearly, one of them is the restoration of the soil,
yeah.
And it's very clear if you study this issue very carefully that the only rational conclusion is that these large animals are really important to integrate into the restoration of these farms. Now, you can do it without them; it's just a little more challenging. Clearly, but ideally, I think they need to be integrated.
Well, I would argue that you cannot do the large landscape.
Large land, all right, large.
Yeah.
Smaller you can.
Right,
Smaller
I agree.
can.
On a smaller, more diversified
Right.
farms, like what you would typically see in the, sort of
Right.
the eastern half of the United States, you
Right.
may be able to do things without the big grazing animals. In areas of, sort of vast open landscapes that are arid or semi-arid, in my view, you have to have the grazing animals.
Yeah, that is an important distinction. And my focus and my bias, I guess, was on the smaller farms. But when you're talking to farms that are or ranches that are thousands of acres, there's no other practical way to do it.
Well,
because you've got to get biomass into the soil. I mean, that is the key. You've got to get it into the soil, and that's one of the most effective ways to do it.
Absolutely, and you have to have this fostering of this cycle of birth and growth and death and decay. That's the key to a healthy ecosystem. And if you don't have animals there, if you just have essentially a naked landscape, which is what you have because humans have, eradicated 99% of wildlife. And so if you have basically these naked landscapes, which is what you have now, that's when the land decays. You need to have the animals.
Excellent. So do you have any recommendations for what the average person can do to be aware of this or to help catalyze the movement in this direction?
Catalyze.
That was an unintended pun.
Well, I think, yes. I mean, I think obviously every person has the opportunity to choose their food carefully. I think that, I actually have, spent many years trying to influence policy that's happening statewide and nationally. And I think that's a really important thing to do. But I always think the most important side of this issue is the consumer side, because that's something everybody does every day. They are purchasing food, they're eating food, they're putting money into the system. And when you're just buying food that is produced in the chemical intensive industrialized way, you're supporting that system. It's often more expensive and more difficult to find the well-produced food. But I think it's something that is really worth our money and it's worth our effort. And in fact, in my view, it's one of the most important things we can do for our own health and for the environment's health. So I certainly urge people to seek out well-raised food. I always encourage people to go to farmers markets, to seek local farmers that have, community supported agriculture, CSA, where you can buy a portion of the food they produce. There's more and more animal-based foods that's available that way too. And so it was, 10 years ago, it was hard to find meat and dairy products at farmers markets and CSAs, but now it's quite widely available. And of course, there are lots of good retail stores as well that carry well-raised food. I really encourage people to learn about how their food is produced and try to find food that was well raised. Now, when it comes to, animal-based foods, I always think the key is grass. Look for foods that were raised with the cycles of the grass, on grass as much as possible.
Yeah, I thank you for pointing that out. And that really is a powerful way that we can catalyze this movement, is to vote with our pocketbooks, and that economic pressure will direct many of these practices. The potential problem with that, though, and is that currently there exists a massive window of opportunity for fraud and deception, because there are many meat producers who are legally applying grass-fed to their product when in fact it isn't. It's given to the feedlot and just as conventionally and loaded with growth hormones and antibiotics. So we're actually in the process of partnering with some of the big leaders to develop a certification of American grass-fed standard. And that certification process hopefully will be standardized within the next year.
Yeah, I agree that the labels are not that useful in some ways. It's a good starting point, though. I think people are on a journey, and a lot of times they're right now, if they're at their starting point, they're shopping almost entirely in a grocery store, and they have to kind of depend on the labels. And I actually think, the best food is not really in the grocery stores. So the next step is getting out of the grocery stores as much as possible and getting closer to the source. The grass-fed label is imperfect, but it is still better than nothing. So if you see beef, it is regulated by USDA. If you see beef that says that it's grass-fed, there are certain things that it can and cannot be done for that label. And I've read through the regulations, and they're pretty good. I agree they're flawed. But
they are flawed, seriously flawed.
But so. I would encourage people to look for that until there's something better.
Yeah, and as I said, it's in process right now, and hopefully within the next year that'll be finalized, and you will be able to go to a grocery store. But right now, before the American grass-fed label is adopted and really available, then it makes a lot of sense to get to know the person who actually raised the rancher who raised that beef and know what his or her practices were to produce them, because otherwise there really is no assurance.
And also, there are groups of farmers and ranchers. I mean, we've always been, we're not with the Niman Ranch Company anymore. We have a new company that's called BN Ranch. But both of the companies that we've been involved in are collections of farmers and ranchers. So sure. You can get to know what that group is practicing and how they're raising their animals. And so knowing the individual farmer is a good way. Knowing what the group's practices are is another good way.
Sure. And as you mentioned earlier, another challenge and complication that many people aren't aware of, even though a significant percentage, and you thought maybe even the majority of ranchers are raising their animals properly. It's just that they're shifting them off to the feedlots. And they're not doing they're doing that because they really don't have any practical choice. That has to do with the processing plants that just simply do not exist in this country. And as a result of that, I don't think most people are aware that most grass-fed meat or beef in this country is not raised in the U.S. It's imported from overseas, which is absolutely insane. So the adoption of this standard in conjunction with the facilitation of an adoption of more processing plants locally that ranchers can shift their animals to is really part of the solution. And it's a big economic investment to put these processing plants together. About $50 million, I understand, to create one of them.
There are many barriers to American farmers and ranchers right now to getting their meat all the way to market. So what's happened is, as you mentioned, there's been this, loss of the processing, the slaughterhouses and the processing facilities. That's a really important piece of the puzzle. The other thing is it's just very labor intensive. You have people who are working very, very hard on their farms and ranches, and they don't have time to do everything that it takes to get. It's much easier to pull a carrot out of the ground and take it to a farmer's market than it is to do everything that it takes to get meat safely, to the consumer. And so that's why, to me, in my view, the meat issue is distinct from, fruits and vegetables as far as the best way to get it to the consumer. And I think farmers and ranchers coming together is a really sensible way to get that accomplished.
Sure. So ideally that's the case, and hopefully within the next year or so this will be less of an issue, because a lot of these logistical issues will have been worked out, and we'll be able to have access to that more conveniently through our grocery store, through a well-recognized and honorable certification rather than the deceptive one that currently exists. So I'm wondering if you have any final recommendations, comments, or something you'd like to emphasize that you've already mentioned.
Well, we didn't talk about it explicitly, but I think it's really important that people have some understanding of this issue of climate change and beef production, because there's so much conversation about it right now, and the vast majority of it is simply inaccurate. The bottom line on that is there have been a series of studies and reports that have quantified the total impact of livestock on the climate change issue, and there's some very good work that's been done on it. But then there are a host of statistics that are bandied about that are not scientifically based at all. And the most credible work that's been done on this in the United States was done by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. It has quantified the total impact of all of the grazing animals, the cattle, goats, sheep, domesticated bison, everything, as contributing about 2% of greenhouse gases to the total climate change picture in the United States. Now, globally, the number is a little bit higher. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations says that it's about 9% total. But the bottom line is that number is far smaller than many people have been hearing lately, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. And even that number, in my view, is far higher than the actual number, because it doesn't include any consideration of the mitigation, these sort of positive impacts that we've been talking about, the carbon sequestration. And actually, there's really good research even on the methane question that's been coming out in the last few years, showing that where you have an intact ecosystem, the soil microbes actually deal with a large amount of the methane. There was even one study in Australia that was done at a university in Australia showing that the total methane in a well-managed pasture system was fully offset. That was what was emitted from the cattle was fully offset by those soil microbes. So we're just getting a very slanted picture in a lot of the information that's out there. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that this is a complex issue, and it's hard to grapple with all of the facts and all the science. But I also think it has to do with the fact that people are so disconnected with food production and with agriculture nowadays. And so a lot of the groups that are sort of talking about this are urban-based environmental groups, and they have very little understanding of what's actually happening on the land and how ecosystems function. And so I think it's very important to rebuff that very popularly held myth that cattle and beef are a huge problem on a climate change standpoint.
Yes, well, there are some people who discount that climate change, and that's a whole other separate issue that I'm not going to address here. But for those who accept it, right, and vilify beef production as a serious contributing factor, what really annoys me, seriously annoys me, might be more accurate, is their ignorance of the impact of industrial agriculture, which most likely exceeds that by a factor of 10 to 20. with respect of its impact the production of CO2. I mean, it's just that actually, my understanding, it actually exceeds the impact on the burning of fossil fuels.
Well, the whole impact of agriculture is smaller than fossil fuel emissions, but you're absolutely right that the total impact of agriculture, the vast majority of it, comes from the production of and use of the agricultural chemicals and from the sort of giant monocropping system that we have, sort of all over the world now, which is basically stripping away the life out of the soil and strips the protective vegetation off of the earth. Mm-hmm. And so you have obviously the emissions from the machines and so forth, but you're also completely destroying the soils and all of that wonderful biological life that we keep talking about, which is the core of a healthy ecosystem. And so I agree with you. I share your frustration 100% that the focus is totally off in the climate change discussion when it comes to food production. We really should be looking at the culprits in terms of the industrialization and the chemicals and the fossil fuel dependence, rather than focusing so intently and so off base, on the ruminants, which are actually an essential component of regenerative systems.
Sure, and plowing the soil, which is, one of my heroes is Gabe Brown, and I'm sure you're familiar with Gabe, yes. And, he helped me understand the importance of bare soil. You have to have vegetation on the soil or a cover on it. Otherwise it's not going to have an armor. It's just going to lose all of its value in microbial activity.
Exactly.
So
that's
just key.
That is the key. And that's why the ruminants are so important, because you can produce food keeping that incredibly dense vegetative cover intact year-round. And you can't do that any other way except for with the grazing animals.
Well, let's hope we can convince a significant number of people to embrace this concept, because it really is needed. Otherwise, we are most likely headed for some environmental catastrophe once we veer off of these basically ancient practices that have been there for many thousands of years. We're going to have problems. So it's an important and necessary adoption that we need. So thank you for all your work in this area. I greatly appreciate it.
I love what I do, and I feel it's incredibly important. And I'm really excited that more and more people are focusing on these issues, because they are so important and so urgent.